Hello, welcome back to Cupcake Digital Painting Part 3, Frosting. This is our end goal for today's lesson. Your project will look something like this by the end of this tutorial. Today's lesson focuses on how to paint in the frosting of the cupcake. Here's what you're going to need to set this up. In this tutorial, we will be adding a new color layer and positioning it between your sprinkle layer and your shadow layer from our last tutorial. This layer is also going to be at 50% opacity while you're working. Your sprinkle and candy layer and your shadow layer will also be at 50% while you're working. You will always want to be working in the frosting layer, and it's okay if you paint over the candy, it won't be affected. So this is where we left off. We're going to start by adding a new color layer, so click the plus sign and position this layer underneath your candy layer and in between your shadow layer. From here, you want to reposition the opacity sliders so that each slider is at 50% for all three of your layers, the candy, the frosting layer, and the shadow layers. Now you're ready to work on the frosting layer, so make sure that is highlighted blue. Selecting your acrylic paintbrush, 30% opacity, and a light color of your choice. You're going to start adding color to your frosting using a light pressure. If you go outside of the lines too much, use the undo arrow and you can go back, select a smaller brush size. I recommend zooming in so you can clearly see where your edges are, so that way you can work neatly and keep your frosting color contained within the shape of the frosting that you see in your reference photograph. You're still going to see some of your shadows coming through. Work your way around your edges, and you're going to continue to apply your color with a light pressure. You're going to go over your shadow colors, go over them lightly. You still want to be able to see them. And again, it's okay if you paint on top of your candy, because that's in a separate layer. Those candies will not get affected. So if you paint on top of sprinkles, or if you paint on top of a piece of M&M, something like that, it won't affect it. As I approach a really dark shadow, I'm not applying too much color into those areas. I'm focusing on coloring in the frosting where I see it as bright white and where I see some light grays. And again, I'm using a light pressure. I'm looking for anywhere that could be considered frosting, and I'm painting that with my pink color that I selected. I'm going right up against the edges or right through the edges of the sprinkles, looking for any little in-between areas, making sure that I don't miss any frosting spaces. I can switch back to a larger brush size for bigger areas that are more open. Now that I've used a lighter brush, a smaller brush to edge out around the outline of the frosting, I can just quickly go in and fill this all in here with that same color. From here, let's check your progress so far. Also, make sure you're saving as you're working. To check our progress, I want you to hide your photo layer by clicking the eye icon, and then you're going to bring the opacity slider up to 100% for the shadow layer. You're going to bring it up to 75% for the frosting layer. We want this at 75 so that it blends with our shadow layer, and your candy layer will be at 100% opacity. So this is what your painting will look like so far. We're still going to add some extra highlights and shadows to the frosting. To start adding extra shadows to your frosting, bring all of your layers back to 50% opacity and keep your photo layer hidden. You're going to pick a darker version of the color you used for your frosting, and you're going to start to lightly apply this darker color over where you see shadows in your frosting. So it's just going to be a light pressure accenting those shadows. It should still be at 30% opacity in your brush settings. We want this color to be light. You don't want it to be too heavy. You want your shadows to still appear pretty soft and blendable. It is okay if you end up seeing some brush strokes later on, but what we're doing is sort of just tinting the shadows with this darker color. So you're going to go in and recheck your work by bringing your opacity scales up again and keeping your frosting layer still at 75% opacity instead of 100. Now what I'm doing with all of these settings in place is I'm just going in and kind of tinting some of my sprinkle shadows and candy shadows on my frosting with this color, and it's kind of giving it a subtle tint so that way the shadows on the frosting don't look just grayed out or too blacked out. They're going to take on that frosting color. At this point, doing this process, you should see that the frosting is starting to appear more three-dimensional. And in order to really create that three-dimensional quality, we're going to add some highlights. So I want you to select a lighter version of your cupcake color. If you have a really, really light color, then you can try using white. So I'm picking a really light pink, so it's like a tint. And with a soft pressure, I'm going to apply this in a soft brushstroke manner to the edge where I see my shadow. So I'm looking for that shadow edge and I'm applying that brush stroke right along that edge there. And this is going to be done softly so that it blends into the other pink that's around it already. You should see 3 values in your frosting emerging. You should see your base color pink, your really light color, and your darker color. If you didn't select pink as your frosting color, that's okay. Your work should still be looking three-dimensional regardless of what color frosting you selected. So I'm using soft little brush strokes here and just bringing some of that highlight into the outer edges of the cupcake frosting. Again, looking for that edge where the shadow is meeting that base pink color and streaking in some of that tinted accent color there. This highlight will allow your frosting to look much more three-dimensional. Once you have your frosting complete, this is a good time to take a screenshot. This is what you will want to submit for your work for today. This is your finished frosting portion of your project, and from here we'll be moving on to a separate tutorial which will show you how to achieve the effects for the cupcake wrapper.